So the second roundtable is going to be devoted to distributive impacts in the computation of a net present value international experiences. And I suggest we start with some examples of countries. So first example could be given by Ben Groom from the UK. So he's an academic in the University of Exeter, but also really involved in the Green Book. So if you can tell us a little bit on what the UK is doing or not doing regarding redistributive impact.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Je veux commencer à dire...
I'll start by saying that I'm really sorry. I'm the only person here that is not able to speak French.
Right, thank you. And thank you for the invitation. Very nice to be here. In the UK, it's already been mentioned that in the UK there are some considerations of distributive effects that are documented in the Green Book, which is the central guidelines for cost-benefit analysis that all departments across the government have to use when undertaking evaluation of their investments and policy changes and such like. But that's really at the end of the process here, actually. And in fact, if you look at the Green Book and think about where distribution is mentioned and distributive analysis is mentioned, and the Green Book itself really should be thought of as a process rather than this final analysis of a selected project. So distributional effects are really considered from the beginning, from project selection, from rationale for particular interventions, through long listing of projects that should be considered for government investment, down to the shortlisting. And at each stage, the distributional analysis takes a kind of slightly different form. So in the very first instance, when you're thinking about rationales, then it's a kind of let's say, broad brush evaluation of the distributional effects. And these should be reported in a selection to the long list if there are significant distributional effects that are considered. So this is, words like significant and so on, fairly subjective, but the kind of overarching principle there, which was mentioned in Luc's presentation to some extent, is the I think I'm in a good position to say this. It's a very English idea of proportionality. Yes, we do like this, but maybe let's be proportional about this. So the issue of proportionality is very central to this process of selecting projects. So significant distributional effects will play a significant part. So negative effects on distribution on poor parts of the society will definitely lead to some projects being put aside where other ones perform better on that side of things. Then when it comes to the long listing, again, it's a question of making clear to decision makers the distributional effects of different projects. And this again is without any kind of reference to how much inequality aversion and how much one project contributes or not to a sort of social welfare function. It's really just trying to spell out the details of where the distributional effects lie in proportion to the magnitude of the project always, okay? So then it comes down to shortlisting of projects and again, the similar kind of proportional, but more detail is required at this stage. When you have a selection of shortlisted projects or policies, here you really need to do much more detailed analysis on the distributional effects, right? And if projects are have small effects on distribution, then that really is noted for ministers to think about, and then if it has larger effects, then that goes to further analysis. And it's only at that point that you start thinking about the detail of chapter 3, I think it is, of the Green Book, where distributional weights are discussed, and then the implementation of distributional weights on the project proper can be implemented. So the way we do that, of course, is just by having kind of, in principle, the guidance basically says that we reweight based on a kind of inverse utility, marginal utility, as Mark was making clear before. And we use an inequality aversion parameter of 1.3, which is coming from a paper by Richard Layard, which looks at it looks at kind of subjective well-being and how that varies with income. So it's a marginal utility concept of feeding into equity weights. So that's the kind of broad brush of I think that I can sort of, I'd say one more thing about all of this. So stepping back, the issue of distributive weights in cost-benefit analysis has been discussed since the 60s and 70s when Little and Merlis first pushed cost-benefit analysis, and generally it was talked about in the context of developing countries, in poor countries, right? Because that was the context in which cost-benefit analysis was really taken place, and the extent to which it's been used has sort of changed historically over time. So in the 70s, this was used in cost-benefit analysis. In the 80s, not so much. Harburger's view of this was that it was the classic view that Mark explained earlier on, that actually if we're concerned about inequality, then perhaps marginal projects are not the way to basically achieve that target, was the kind of thing. So separation of efficiency and equity. If you're concerned about equity, then there are better instruments out there to solve this, thinking about progressive taxation and such like. So I think we've seen a lot of evidence today that this is sort of a bit of an old school view, actually, an old-fashioned view. And there are many other reasons to think about in introducing this kind of weighting into cost-benefit analysis. Now, from my experience, and in the context of the UK guidance, so I used to work in development as well, and my brother also, he's an economist. We're all very boring people in my family, but my brother works in development. He's worked on transport economics projects in developing countries for the past 20, 30 years. I worked for several years in Southern Africa as a member of civil service. Never were distributive weights used in any of the analysis that we did in that time. And I suppose in some respects it could be, but the stakes were more about the size of the pie in those days than actually how it was distributed. And there were other stopgap measures for thinking about poverty, which was the kind of chief distributive concern in those days. So there's some interesting historical reasons, I think, why we've seen the ebb and flow of the consideration of using equity weights in cost-benefit analysis. And I think it was interesting to see how the Biden administration, the process that led up to the A4, A94, has come back now to thinking about, had come back, I should say, to thinking about equity weights and so forth. One last point is that, of course, and this has been made by many of the speakers as well, is that, of course, our equity concerns vary along many different dimensions, and the distributive weights are really just thinking about income, right? And of course, inequality varies across many of the other dimensions that we're considering, and that would not really be taken into account by looking at using distributive weights. So we've seen already from the other speakers that how we handle inequality and distributional effects takes on many dimensions, and so a guidance needs to be more varied than just thinking about the narrow aspect of distributive weights. And even Harburger, who was the classic efficiency equity, split the efficiency and equity aspects, was of a mind to think this way, thinking in the World Bank guidelines that one should just think about how the basic requirements of survival were affected by different policies, rather than using distributive weights in the cost-benefit analysis. So that's my summary from the Green Book, through the different aspects of project selection, through to how you actually handle projects that you've selected, and a brief historical background.
Thank you very much, Ben. Now we can have an idea of how is it tackled in the European Investment Bank, because we have Doramas Jorge Calderon from this bank here, so economist there with a special expertise in transport economics and CBA.
Thank you very much. Well, shall we? Yeah, okay. Shall we go to the next first slide, please? How do you have a click? Okay. Well, perhaps a very short introduction about the EIB. So the EIB is the project financing arm of the European Union, and we finance projects mostly in the European Union, but also outside the EU for countries which might be exceeding the EU as candidates, or countries in developing countries where we may have the Union will have development cooperation agreements. So we, in terms of activity, about 10-20% is outside the EU, and the rest is in EU by volume. In terms of number of operations, we spend much more time, obviously, in countries, in projects in developing countries than per project than projects in the EU, which are relatively easier. Okay, important to understand. Well, first of all, I'm going to be talking, whatever reference I make about cost-benefit analysis will be from the capital investment point of view, not from the policy point of view. We are policy implementers through capital investment projects. We don't devise, design, or agree on policy at all. The Commission may use us for consultation purposes and to have feedback on their policies. Sometimes when we implement policies and the policies have not been subject to cost-benefit analysis, we have to develop cost-benefit analysis to understand what the value of the policies are in practice. But we only think in terms of capital investment projects. The status of the bank, which frame what we can do, you can read it there, and the remit is about economic productivity in general. Economic productivity, some people in the bank and in the stakeholders on the bank take it as merely GDP, and there's nowhere in the statutes or in the policy documents of the bank that we should use cost-benefit analysis, but economists there, we say, well, the productivity in general means that we must have a broader approach and vantage point than just income, and we look at societal value as well, and that is the way in of cost-benefit analysis. Thing which is important here in the context of capital investment projects is the attainment of the internal market. You may introduce a policy which can be done relatively quickly, and the policy can be changed relatively quickly, but when we're talking about capital assets, we are talking about very long periods of time when policy can change even before the asset starts to operate. And that very often, particularly infrastructure assets, once the asset is built, it stays there, is sunk and cannot be removed. So one has to take a very long-term view of things and has to be ready to conceive projects or support projects that can stand the consequences of policies changing through the life of the project. That is very important. Even though we are focused on productivity in general, there have been inroads into looking at understanding the distributional consequences of projects. And the main example we have is one that was developed 20 years ago to appraise railway projects. It's called RailPAC, and it was devised jointly with the European Commission. It is available online. And there, what the aim was to understand who the winners and losers are. It stopped short of introducing distributional weights. It just understood trying to understand better in a project who the winners and losers or payers would be. Of course, a CBA you cannot do the aggregation in two ways. You can do it through willingness to pay and resource cost, or you can do it through surpluses. This would be an aggregation through surpluses, looking into a much more disaggregated way. So even though we've looked into this, it is still within the remit of productivity, but just trying to understand better what really happens with the project, which is always useful. I have to say that this was used for a short while, but because we are not planners and we don't decide on what projects go ahead and don't go ahead and how to design projects, but we just agree or disagree to finance projects that we consider that support the remit of us supporting improvements in general productivity. The reality is that it has fallen into this use. Okay, we still do some CBAs through aggregation of surpluses, so we still understand who the winners and the losers are in many of our projects, but it is not something in which we have to report to our decision-making bodies. That is something for them to consider on. After this, actually, the issue of income distribution has not really raised in what we've been asked from our governing bodies or civil society to look at. Important to understand that when we have a remit to finance the least developed regions in Europe, we are not really talking about distributional weights. We are talking about intervening in those regions to improve productivity in those regions. Okay? So the parameters that we may have may even be disfavorable to the project because we may demand a higher discount rate, for example. But the aim is to improve productivity, so efficiency in those regions. We do not assign, even if the ultimate aim of the policy is to redistribute geographically, to some say, or to encourage investments in regions which are less developed. We do not use distributional weights to appraise, the effects on the utility of the different welfare of the different stakeholders in that region. And by the way, I mean the only issues. I mean, this is something relative to what Ben said before. I mean, the only other time that we've been asked to look at things, or civil society has access to look at things, are to do with gender, for example, not with income. So we have done some research on whether gender issues makes a difference in certain types of projects. Now, when considering to implement distributional weights, I'm narrowing now to distributional weights in cost-benefit analysis for capital investment projects. I'm really not talking about policy issues. It's capital investment projects. I would raise three themes that are worth considering. I mean, I'm not taking a vantage point of whether we're in favor or whether we are against the introduction of distributional weights, but eventually introducing distributional weights in the context of capital investment projects will raise a number of issues. First of all is that capital asset is about production and it's about productivity. And if you are going to decide against the project that is not the most productive, you are really going against the nature of capital investment. It's almost not as if you have a regressive income income tax policy is almost as if you have a regressive wealth tax policy. Okay, you are going against the very nature of the problem, which is having a capital asset base that is aimed at producing, and the more you produce per unit of input, the better. That is the way things. There's another thing as well, which is in the technical department where I work in the bank. So we do the technical, economic, and so on due diligence for the projects in which we invest, and we give our recommendations. The economists are only about 25% of the personnel there. Most are engineers, actually. I would say about 65%, and the rest are environmental and social engineers. Also, the social engineers are not the same as, it's not the same thing as conducting a CBA. I mean, they have other ways of thinking, and indeed, when we value things in monetary terms, they are taken sometimes a little bit aback, and we have to be able to explain very well what it is that we are doing. Okay, so one thing to bear in mind is that in the capital, in the context of capital investment projects, doing anything that goes against productivity is really going against the nature of why people save in order to invest, in order to be able to produce more, to consume more in the future. The other thing is that we are a supranational institution. We have to invest in countries where, with legal systems, even within the EU, with legal systems and different, which are different and which have enshrined in them attitudes to the distribution which are different from one another. If we were to introduce distributional weights in our appraisals, we will have to take into account that the values, if it is income, for example, is marginal utility of income, whether that is all there is in the distributional policies of the country hosting the project, and whether we are going to be doing and recommending things different to what the legislature in a given country has decided. For example, these are issues that will have to be addressed. And then the third point is more me as a practitioner of CBA. The concerns about what CBA becomes and how we can explain it to stakeholders and decision makers. At the moment, the need to explain what CBA tells you is continuous, is constant. It never stops. I mean, because stakeholders change, decision makers change, and you have to continuously keep educating them on about what CBA is telling them. I mean, we finance projects which are someone is paying back the loan. We don't give subsidies, so someone is paying back the loan. Either the project pays it back, or the taxpayer pays it back, or the government pays it back. When we look, we do both financial and economic appraisal. And when we try to explain what economic appraisal is, well, they naturally, decision makers, even economists, they would think in terms of GDP, they will think in terms of jobs, whatever. And you have to go back to them and say, no, you're doing something else. What we found to be the easiest way of explaining what CBA is, well, you're extending the financial appraisal, in which obviously you have the values of output and the value of input for the investors, and you are extending it to all the other stakeholders affected by the project. So there's a value, there's an underlying willingness to pay benchmark or numeraire, if you will, whereby we can explain that it really is to think of it in terms not of GDP or in terms of job creations or whatever, but in terms of you're generating value, but you're generating value for stakeholders other than just the investors in the project. If we are going to depart from that, and we are going to weight things, and $1 in one person is not the same thing as $1, or €1 in this case. €1 is not the same as €1 in another person. things become a bit more complicated to explain. Remember also that there are, if you will, people who don't like CBAs, even economists who don't like CBA. In fact, we do CBA in about half of our projects. The rest we do cost-effectiveness analysis or multi-criteria analysis. Multi-criteria analysis is something that is very attractive because people with, even people with relatively little technical knowledge can still have a say on the project, and that's something, it conveys power to those people, and obviously they become stakeholders in the decision-making process, and they want to rely on that. Of course, multi-criteria analysis, if there are problems in the implementation of CBA, the problems in the implementation of multi-criteria analysis multiply. And one thing that we what we normally do to defend CBA is that, well, this CBA, of the alternatives that there are, the perfect alternative obviously doesn't exist. But of the alternatives that there are, is the one that is more objective in terms of what are the assumptions that you are making. On what quantitative basis are you judging the project? And as soon as we start introducing elements which cannot be measured, where $1 in one person is €1 in one person is not the same thing as €1 in another person, we risk entering the realm of qualitative appraisal. And there, you open the floodgates, as it were. I mean, there's a lot of people who defend multi-criteria analysis, and they may see it as an entry point to broaden that. I'm not saying that we should not do it. All I'm saying is that it's a theme, it's something to bear in mind when trying to alter going from an efficiency to a utility CBA.
Thank you very much. I think I would distinguish a little bit between multi-criteria analysis and qualitative approach, because I think mainly the issue with multi-criteria is that at the end you need to take a decision which meets in some weights that are not necessarily transparent. But sometimes you cannot say everything you in the CBA, and I think Luc told that earlier. I mean, it can complement a CBA maybe with some qualitative elements. Anyway, I would like to leave the floor now to Massimo Florio, who is an emeritus professor at University of Milan. And he wrote an amazing book I do recommend on applied welfare analysis, so cost-benefit analysis of projects and policies. And he is going to, if you're not already convinced, show us a great example, I think, on why we should consider using weights in CBA, weights for, redistribution impact.
Thank you very much. I understand that Marc Fleurbe, in his introduction, mentioned that innovation will be one of the future threats for revision of the current guidelines here in this country. 10 years ago, we, myself with my colleagues, convinced the European Commission, DG Regional Policy, to include research and innovation in the domain of cost-benefit analysis for investment projects. After all, if we are increasingly a knowledge-based economy, having roads but not having science in the scope of investment appraisal would cut too much. So what I will do here is to give you an example, rather unconventional, if you wish, of where distributional issues would appear even in something quite exotic as a synchrotron radiation source. A synchrotron radiation source is a big X-ray microscope. This one is Alba, near Barcelona. But if you go in Saclay, you may find another one with the modest name of Soleil. Very French, I mean. So what Alba or Soleil do is to accelerate electrons. These electrons accelerated generate X-rays, photons, orders of magnitude more powerful than the kind of X-rays we are accustomed in hospitals or elsewhere. And these machines cost 100 million euros in terms of capital investment, plus they are used by scientists. On the right part of the slide, you might see the experimental stations where the beams are conveyed and where samples of proteins or samples of material to build batteries or whatever are analyzed. So this is a research infrastructure, meaning that there are shifts, literally days and nights, of scientists who apply for some hours of the beam to analyze these samples. So what scientists do, and this is a public investment, is a public infrastructure. What scientists usually do is to publish the results. So we are here in the scope of a public investment, a public infrastructure, practicing open science. The beam are delivered for free to scientists, and a flow of publications every year are generated. Then what will happen is that after some years, and you can track this, after some years, there will be companies who file patents based on discoveries, citing those publications as non-patent literature. You may see there some figures. P0 means that something as 3,000 publications were generated in some years at Alba. Then there were 50,000 publications citing those publications. And in the end, we identified over 3,480 patents, families related to that literature. So if you distinguish across scientific fields, you may see that for each experiment there are results in, for instance, solid state physics or bioscience or instrumentation chemistry and so on. So where distributional issues arise here? One of the most important fields where there is this flow of knowledge going from the research infrastructure to the publications, to the other publications citing those publications, and in the end patents, is the pharmaceutical industry. And what a patent is. A patent is a legal monopoly, usually up to 20 years, usually for 20 years, plus some additional exclusivity years, that in fact fends the intellectual property and generates rents, generates extra profits. According to a study by the General Accounting Office in the United States, the profitability of the drug industry is twice the profitability of other industries with companies of similar dimension. So the end of the story is that if you perform a cost-benefit analysis of this knowledge infrastructure, you would end up with taxpayers, including taxpayers of lower income, who finance research. This immediately benefits scientists, which are probably middle income, but in the very end, this benefits the investors of corporations, including some of the big pharma. And you may think that everything goes well because profits in the end are taxed, but this is not the case, because the big pharma are famous for eluding taxes through the multinational structure and using tax havens. So you can see, even in this very unconventional example, if I have to do a cost-benefit analysis of this public investment, I would end up with a poor, a low-income taxpayer paying through the government of Spain and Catalonia the functioning as an open science public of this infrastructure, and in the end there will be an investor of a big pharma profiting from that. So you see why we need distributional impact analysis in cost-benefit analysis.
Yeah, exactly. Before we go to the fourth speaker, I would be very interested in knowing what Doramas thinks about that, and then the view of the European investment banks on that, after having speaking about productivity and.
I'm not. We only invest in the U.S. pharma industry, so I cannot tell you about that. But the next question is then, who benefits from the profit of apart from the taxpayer, who benefits from the profit of pharma? Sometimes we've seen in some countries that some of the highest returns in infrastructure that can generate profit, ports, airports, some toll roads, are state infrastructure investors that use equity investment as hidden taxation. So you have tax on profit, and then you may have the government who wants to raise additional revenues. They create an investment fund, and then they invest in infrastructure. And what we've seen is that often, not always, the cost of capital of that investment, of that infrastructure facility goes up. And it's a hidden way through profit of government raising taxes without counting as taxes. That can happen. So in the case of pharma, I don't know. But the next question, I don't think that high profit necessarily means that you need distributional weights. You have to understand who benefits from that profit as well.
Thank you. So far this morning we had a lot of view of experts on what we should do with distributional impacts. We touch a little bit the behavioral aspect, but I think it would be very interesting to know more what people themselves, different stakeholders, things we should do about that. And so Danaé Arroyos-Calvera is going to speak about that. So she's an academic in Birmingham, and especially focusing on behavioral economics.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to be telling you about stated distributional preferences. So we've heard that it's important to incorporate these trade-offs, and the question that I'm trying to answer is which trade-offs, and in particular, which trade-offs do people want to make? So I'm going to be telling you about the work that I've been doing with some colleagues, where we actually ask people how they wanted to trade off efficiency versus other distributional concerns. So what we did is we recruited people from different countries. These will be overrepresented from the UK, and they will be English speakers, but they come from a few different countries. And we asked them 2 types of questions. So the first questions were similar to a discrete choice experiment, where we presented different policies that helped 2 areas in a hypothetical city. And so we told them there's this policy that has this much efficiency and this much equality, etc. And then we varied these parameters and we had them make choices. So they were making trade-offs between different numbers. And then we also asked them in a different part of the study about moral principles. So they don't have to trade off specific numbers, but they have to say whether they would rather have efficiency, even where that comes at the expense of equality, for example, or other concerns. So you can see we asked them about efficiency, self-interest, which is whether the policy could help them personally, equality, which is where we provide the same benefit to everybody, and then helping those most at risk. And on the second column of the table, you can see how each unit in these dimensions, so for example, if a policy saved 1 more life in expectation, because these were in the safety and health context, how would that influence choice of that policy? So what we see here is that people actually support favoring efficiency by quite a lot. So every unit of efficiency increases choice of that policy by 26%, but they also care about other distributional concerns. So the second and third on our list were self-interest and equality. And we can see the orders of magnitude, the relative trade-offs that they're willing to make. When we compare self-interest and equality, they're actually not significantly different. So these 9 and 5 can be taken as the same number. And then we saw that helping those at the highest risk actually had a very small impact on choice that was not significantly different from 0. So the people did not seem to want to favor in this dimension. So what's good about this? What's good is that we actually found consistent answers across different elicitation methods. So anyone that has been involved in preference elicitation will know that this is quite hard. So this is very positive. And we also found that these preferences were stable. So we asked these participants before the COVID outbreak, so this was either a couple of years or a couple of months, and then we re-invited them without telling them that it was the same people, and we asked them the same questions, and the sample overall gave us the same, not exactly the same, but qualitatively the same preferences. So we actually think that this is very important, and it supports using some input, at least from these. And then we've also spoke about having other preferences. So in the previous slide, I just showed you general distributional preferences that didn't have anything to do with who the people they were being helped were. And in a following study that we're currently still analyzing, we also asked about whether people wanted to prioritize people depending on their age group and depending on their health, which is something that has been mentioned before. So we found that people did prefer to help the younger group. And again, we can now see how that compares to the other criteria that we could use to include distribution on preferences. To learn more about health, you'll have to keep in touch because we haven't analyzed this data yet. So yeah, you'll just have to read the paper when it's out. And just to finish, I just want to tell you about the limitations of this approach because, of course, it doesn't come without limitations. So first of all, the responses that I showed you was a highly selected sample, so it was a convenient sample, but we think that this is a good proof of concept, and of course, if we wanted to use this into policy, we would need a representative sample of the population to answer these questions. Then we don't know for sure whether these preferences might be context-specific. So today we've been talking about a lot of different applications. These ones only apply to health and safety, and it is possible that people feel differently about other areas, so say high-tech investment. And then, of course, because we're asking people about their preferences, and these preferences involve others, it might be the case that they're just trying to show you, the experimenters or the researchers, that they're nice. So there might be a bit of social desirability bias here, but again, there's quite a lot of research about how to limit the extent of these in questionnaires. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. So I don't know if you want to react the one to the other presentations, but maybe my first question was about the why we should account for redistributive impact when computing NPV. I think it has been already touched during the presentation, but if you want to add something, and maybe on the side of whether we need inequality aversion or not to actually account for that. So, the floor is yours. Ben, maybe?
Well, I think it really is worth thinking about why you want to do this, right? So is it just, do we have something in mind, a vision of a fair society with a particular income distribution and we're trying to get towards that in some way? Or is this, and so there are sort of technical reasons why we would want to introduce sort of equity weighting and other kind of aspects of distribution into the cost-benefit framing. Or are these more, as we heard from the previous presentation, more to do with kind of procedural reasons about making the procedures of decision-making openly take into account distributional issues for the purpose of, displaying that things are done in a transparent and fair way. So I think it's worth having those discussions. Those aren't necessarily mutually exclusive things, but if it's the former, then one has to have a fairly decent vision of what it is, what level of inequality in society you're aiming for, so for instance, would France be happy with the kind of levels of inequality that you have in, say, Norway and Sweden and Finland, which are much lower? Is that something you want to be going for? And does the introduction of, say, equity weights really help in that process? It's worth asking the question about what is the most, in a sense, efficient way of reaching these overall societal targets. And is it project by project, by government project, or is it by really thinking about the efficiency aspects and then having much more leverage on these broader tools of taxation and so forth? So Aude's going to, at some point, think about an example of flood defences, which, if I understood well, flood defences protecting the houses of rich people. I mean, that sounds awkward as a public policy. But then how much that affects inequality in the end depends on how much you can tax the increase in house prices that go on. So it's sort of conditional in a way on all of these other distributive aspects that and policies and levers that you have in society. So my only point is, like, what is the goal in terms of inequality and distribution that one is trying to reach if one, as a result of kind of introducing this kind of analysis into cost-benefit analysis, it's worth thinking about, right?
Yeah, and also keeping in mind that even if you don't do something actively, I mean, you always implicitly have weights in NPV. So, I mean, it's not, I mean, more than why, it's also going to the how you do that, because even if you don't actively do something, there are weights implicitly in the discussion. And so, Ben, yes, you are right. I mean, if you think about public investment on flooding, I mean, the most efficient thing to be done, it would be to actually protect big houses of rich people, which doesn't seem to be that strikingly a good idea. So probably we can think of doing better. And if we go to the how part of the discussion, and this is something that also has been touched during the first roundtable, there was some mention of marginal utility of income. And then it looks like a relatively good idea, but probably we need to know whether we have a very robust and strong evidence on that, because most probably as soon as we open the Pandora box and we start putting weights on this basis, it's quite hard to reverse or to do something different. So I would like to know if you know about some type of evidence on that. So maybe Massimo.
Let me restate one point that was again mentioned by Mark in his introductory remarks, and that you mentioned again. It is absolutely not true that weights are not used in cost-benefit analysis. They are used. The argument that $1 is $1 means that we are using equal weights, not that we are not using weights. First. Second, when we use a social discount rate, this also was mentioned, we are making comparisons between current and future generations and weighting the welfare of future generations with a certain mechanism. And particularly if we use certain ways to estimate the social discount rate, the technical way this is done include the elasticity of the utility of consumption in the formula, and this is often based on considerations about progressivity of the tax system. So we are doing it. Moreover, what is important to say that often we are doing it in the wrong way because of the fallacy of the argument of the Calderon-Hicks story that if you can compensate, that's potential compensation is enough. Let me go back to my story about the pharma industry. One thing that we have seen during the COVID-19 pandemic, and we did a study for the European Parliament on that, was that the profit margin on a dose of vaccine was something as 900%. Okay? So the dose was sold to we as taxpayers at 10 euros, while the 10 or 24, while the actual cost was, marginal cost was something as 2. So it would be, moreover, African countries didn't get their doses at the same time because the market was not so attractive. So the Calderon-Hicks criterion is very silly. It would say to somebody in South Africa that because an investor of Pfizer potentially would have compensated for not getting his vaccine, the policy was positive. So let me state again that before thinking about the net present value and the welfare weights, we need to think to the substantial issues are there, and they are currently ignored. And I'm very happy, and I applaud the decision in France to pave the way for a serious reconsideration of mistakes done in several contexts about ignoring the fact that weighting is done, but it is done in the wrong way. My point.
And about marginal utility of income and evidence, do you want to share some views, or we keep it for later? Some evidence on that? No, not really.
Well, there is some kind of evidence, I think.
And you would say it is robust and we can use it?
I'm not sure. I wouldn't advise to rush and use this kind of information currently. I would suggest to have a period of time of experimentation of different empirical methods, and in the meanwhile, to be very clear about the need to take into consideration the distributional impact. But my suggestion is to be prudent in this area.
Yeah, if you wish.
Oh, well, I mean, so there's lots of different, so we're thinking about the kind of inequality aversion parameters, so that elasticity that we see in the Ramsey rule and things like that. So there is a lot of evidence out there, and it sort of depends on which is eligible, depends on your view of the welfare function that you're using. So if you're using a kind of utilitarian welfare function and you're thinking about this inequality aversion as being the elasticity of marginal utility, then normatively speaking, the Ramsey rules sort of suggests that it's just any dimension of inequality of consumption, let's say, which is eligible as evidence here, by which I mean risk aversion. We can think about risk aversion. We can think about differences between people today, intra-generational inequality. And so on. So if you're willing to accept that kind of, and in the Ramsey rule and in this sort of utilitarian framework, then that's the same parameter, right? So if you're willing to accept that normative position, then you can, lots of different sources of information are eligible. So we have a paper about this in 2019 for the UK, where we looked at what the intertemporal substitution as a potential source of information on how people like or dislike differences between their incomes now and in the future. We looked at risk aversion, thinking about how people disliked consumption in different states of the world, and then we looked at progressive taxation, which is more about how people like or dislike consumption differences between people in society, right? And fortunately for us, each method in the UK came up with the same answer, so we were able to basically say it's 1.5. Right, which is a reasonable kind of medium value for this. So, like, if you're willing to go down this, and one has to take kind of pragmatic steps if one's going to introduce this into the guidelines, one can extract the information from different sources. But I would say that if we're really concerned about inequality aversion, there is a bunch of experimental work that needs to be done here to sharpen up the analysis. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I would like to finish with a very quick question. We'll try to be quick. About the way to involve stakeholders and people into the way we should design weighted NPV. And in particular, Florio mentioned that this morning when we had a revision in the US of A4, A40, 94 circulars. There was actually a review and there was a huge consultation on that, and documents have been changed following it. So that's my question for you. Do you think it's a good idea? Do you think France should do it, and how to try to do it? And maybe, Danaé, you can start on that?
Yeah, so I can't speak about the circular. I think there were people here that were involved in that consultation, so they will definitely be able to better answer this. But I am definitely in favor of asking people, just given the results that we've seen. So there's a need for this experimental evidence. Sometimes we tend not to rely on people's answers, particularly in this context, but I think there are ways, if we are really careful about how we elicit these preferences, I think we can get robust measures. So I would definitely say we should definitely use it, even if it's just one of the inputs. I would say there will be strength in weighting as well, different types of evidence, but I wouldn't think it's okay to completely exclude citizens' views if what we're trying to do ultimately is to maximize their welfare.
Any other last reaction on that?
So how to get people involved? Yeah, so that was a very interesting process in the US, the public consultation. Some of the issues that came out, which were very interesting, concerned the value of statistical life, right? So this is something which really gets people annoyed. I remember being at UCL doing my PhD, my MSc actually, in '96, and there was an attack on the department by some students from the LSE, and they were complaining about the first climate change report where David Pearce, who was my supervisor later on, had used different values of statistical life for different countries, right? And that was really exercised people. So then the discussion in the US, one of them at least, was to do with whether they should change the value of statistical life for different along the income distribution. So essentially lower for low incomes and higher for high incomes, and because at the moment it's just an average that's used. Anyway, it turns out that that has anomalous effects depending on the project that you're looking at. So it's sort of, for the poor, as it were, the average overweights their well-being. So if there's a project which introduces free public goods like health service and so on, that's more likely to happen. That's good for the poor. But if it's a project which is trying to change behavior, like seat belts or reducing alcohol consumption or something like that, that becomes overvalued for the poor, and so that's detrimental for them because they don't actually value it that much, is the argument. So Cass Sunstein made this argument. So I think in terms of like engagement with people, one has to be very, very careful about how one deals with augmentation when it comes to income distribution in cost-benefit analysis, and see ahead and how this can be avoided. And this goes along with the discussion that happened in the previous session, I think, very, very much in terms of design of policy and such like. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So I think it's time now to get questions from the floor, if there are any.
Hello. Jerome Massiani, University of Milan. I think it's very useful that you mentioned profit, Professor Florio, in this discussion, because the way in which the distributional issue primarily materialized to the analyst, when an analyst is making a CBA, at a certain point he will face two numbers, which are consumer surplus and producer surplus. And maybe he will delay the reflection to later on. Then I will look at how the benefits of the policy spreads among different revenue categories. But even at this stage, there's a question: what do I do with producer surplus? Do I add the producers as people normally do? But I think we should always, in a way, stop for a while when we are just making this implicit assumption that €1 of profit is equal to €1 of consumer profit. So that's a bit a remark, but that's also a question. How would you address this question? In the 2 minutes where the analyst just stops and say, oh, should I do that? What would you like to tell him?
Maybe we can take the second question.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the talk. It was very interesting. A question about substitution and the link with the weights, because we now have quite a lot of projects that involve, for example, energy production from biomass. And there is the question of removing the possibility of some groups using the biomass so that other groups will use that biomass, if you think about methanization or any kind of energy production, you know. So do you think that using weight is a good way to have that trade-off in the cost-benefit analysis, or is it, as you said, in the 80s, that it should be treated outside of the scope of CBA in terms of, well, resource allocation outside of the project? Do you have any input on that? Thank you.
Any of you? Or just two? Yes, sure.
Biomass. I don't know. So maybe I've misunderstood the question, but I mean, so environmental economists I work on forests and ecosystem services and things like that. So the substitution issue there has often been sort of mixed up with the discounting issue. So maybe, you know, because we see substitutability changing over time as with scarcity and so on. And so one could apply a lower discount rate to, so essentially that's a weight that we put on the future. We could apply a lower discount rate if we think that things are becoming more scarce, or indeed if willingness to pay is increasing with growth. So those are the kind of substitutability issues. You see this in transport as well, in terms of the willingness to pay growing over time, and the value of time saved being built in as growing with income rates. And again, that can be interpreted as a lower discount rate on that sort of thing. So I think the answer is yes, that the distribution. So I would be, technically, to me, they're slightly different things, and so I don't like putting everything in the kind of distribution bucket nor in the discounting bucket. So I think in a sense that should be a pricing issue, the substitutability story. That's my view, on my feet right now.
Thank you. Maybe Massimo on producer and
yes,
consumer surplus.
About the issue of the producer surplus, this is a very helpful question. Clearly, if you just introduce producer surplus alongside consumer surplus, again, you are implicitly saying that €1 accruing to the producer is exactly the same value than €1 to the consumer, which means that you so simplify the economy that you have just one consumer, one producer, and they are probably the same person, or they are twins. The real economies are such that usually producers are not the same people as consumers. There are different kinds of consumers and so on. So the distributive analysis is important even at this partial equilibrium level. At general equilibrium, of course, much more than that. So important question. A more general remark about your question about consultation. Statement. Democracy without discussion paves the way to dictatorship. Okay? So, what cost-benefit analysis, what public investment appraisal is part of accountability of government that goes beyond voting every 4 years to appoint a president. If we think that it is enough to vote, we do not need cost-benefit analysis. Then we regret the consequences.
Thank you. I think we have the time of a couple of additional questions. Yes?
Thank you. I'm Florent Coureau from Tech for Life, and my question is from the corporate world, okay? The corporations in Europe will be subject to CSRD, you know, this new regulation, and they will have to use a key concept that has not been questioned so far, as far as I know, is double materiality, by which you should assess not only your financial materiality impacts on the equity valuation, shareholder value, but also on stakeholder value. So my question is following, is double materiality going to impact the CBA methods, or maybe at European Investment Bank or in your works in any manner? Thank you.
We already, I'm not exactly sure about the details of that new measure, but in our CBA, we take into account value to not just to the investor, but to everyone, yeah. And a lot of those values are actually, well, apart from the academic literature, are available are publicly available. Yeah.
Can I just say something as well about that? So the reason why you need a concept like double materiality in the private sector is because the private sector are not doing cost-benefit analysis, right? So that's the only. So that's trying to be a boundary for corporations and portfolios and what have you, to make them take into account some of these external effects. And the idea, I guess, the theory of change there is that we all look at these firms and they disclose the damage they're doing on, let's say, biodiversity or whatever it is, and we remove our capital from there, and the cost of capital goes up. Or we engage more with them and try and change their ways, something like that. It seems rather wishful thinking that that's going to work, actually, but that's at least it's something that they're doing. But as I say, it's because they don't do cost-benefit analysis and they are only concerned about profits that these concepts exist, right?
Thank you. Maybe a very last question we have here, and then probably we have to close the session.
It's closely related to the last question, and it may be for Dr. Calderon. What about funding dual-use technologies that would benefit both ESG issues and defense issues? Is there a CBA case for that? And how would you explain that in simple terms to the general public?
Thank you very much for that question. It's actually something we are thinking about now. We have been financing projects of dual use for a while now. I mean, that question, I link it to a number of other comments that have been made. I mean, remember that even efficiency CBA, which is what we do, even an efficiency CBA, incorporates all the laws, has to take into account all the laws that constrain safety standards, even distributional issues that are enshrined in the law, are included in the law. And so whatever efficiency CBA is done incorporates already costs and mostly costs that are related to the law forces the promoter to include in the project. And indeed, let me depart for half a minute from your question. It is not just in making a decision about financing a project. It's not just the economic value. It's not just the CBA, but there are a number of other criteria also that are taken into account, which are sine qua non to us financing a project. Okay, so I linked the 2 points because multi-criteria analysis it's also been discussed as a proposal to include defense and security issues. I mean, here we're talking about multi-criteria analysis in answering the economic question. Not all the criteria that are used, but as a direct substitute to multi-criteria analysis to provide an answer to the economic question. Is this worth making? Does this add value to society? Or does this increase utility? Okay, now, in the issue of defense, some of the projects in which at least I have been involved, the defense issue is a legal requirement. Okay, so you might have a port, or you might have an airport that you have on one side of the runway you have a civilian use, on the other side of the runway you have military use. So dual use runway, or like in the case of Italy, that you have some air traffic management of civilian airspace, which is supplied by the Italian Air Force, managing civilian traffic. There is a circumstance you already faced. There are some legal requirements, some constraints by the military about how you have to operate that facility, that port or or that airport or that road or whatever, and then that is a constraint is a constrained efficiency problem, okay, which is you have some security and defense requirements that this imposes certain costs on how you deliver a project, and then you go on to see what the value to the consumer, to the producer, and to so is. So that's already done like that. Now going, which I guess is where you are driving at, is, okay, how would we value the additional deterrence, if you wish, that a project is adding to society, particularly if you go on to finance research in military projects or even the manufacturing of defense equipment and so on. All I can tell you is that we are thinking about it still. I mean, beyond the producer surplus, what comes afterward, it's something that is it's relatively new to us as well. I mean, it's a requirement that really developed over the course of the last few months, and so we don't have an answer yet.
Do you want to?
10 words.
Perfect.
We need to be modest. We cannot do a cost-benefit analysis of the atomic bomb.
Well, thank you very much for the last sentence. Thank you very much all for your contributions. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this roundtable.